Meditations with Ryan Slomak.
Hello and welcome to episode 35 of Meditations. I'm your host Ryan Zlomek, and this is a show dedicated to making space for conversation with interesting people just to see what we can learn from one another. On today's show, we have Jaina Shaw, who is a vintage clothing reseller based in Wantagh, Long Island. She owns a shop called Dino-Mite Vintage that she opened in 2021. But rather than thinking about this as a just chat about vintage clothing, it's actually a history of her career in librarianship, talking about kindness and the way in which she recognized it sort of shifting in the different places that she lived, thinking about quality of clothing, quality of garments, and the history of them, and the way in which she can preserve them at her shop and ensure that she sort of handpicks the best quality for her customers. As always, we want to have a little bit of fun, so you may just end up with some movie suggestions by the end. Without further ado, though, let's hear about reselling. Here is Jaina Shaw. So, Jaina, I'm here in upstate New York, and you're there in downstate New York. How are things happening in Long Island currently?
Uh, that's a good question. I think, I'm not from here. I'm originally from Minnesota, and then I lived in Connecticut for about 13 years. So I keep thinking, oh, I'm new to Long Island, but then it occurred to me I've been here for 5 years. But, part of that was during COVID. So, yeah. And I mean, I live in central Nassau County, which is, it's very different, I think, from other parts of Long Island. And at least around me, I live, the history of Levittown, right?
I don't.
Oh my gosh.
No. Teach
I
me.
was I was obsessed with learning about this in college. Like, I was an art history major, and I took an architecture class, and Levittown, New York was the first planned suburb. There, you could tell I'm a librarian, like I I
We're,
by trade, but
and
I
we're going to dig into that, Jada. So I'm
yes.
very excited about that part. But enlighten me. So the first planned suburb was Levittown, New York.
Right, because post World War II, there was a housing shortage for all of these veterans who'd just come back, were starting families. They were actually living kind of almost in tent cities, if I remember this correctly. And so the enterprising Levitt family started building a planned community in Levittown, New York. There's actually another one in outside of Pittsburgh, I think, Levittown, Pennsylvania. And so, I mean, we can, there's a lot of problematic stuff that goes with it where, they didn't allow, Black people or Jew, that kind of stuff to, just typical. Every history is
Legitimized gatekeeping. Right.
right. But the concept, at least, was these affordable houses. There were maybe like 5 different models to choose from. They could go up in a day because they were prefabricated. So the Levitt houses, none of them had basements, and they left them pretty basic. There was usually like 2 bedrooms on the first level, a boiler, a kitchen, and then an unfinished attic. And the concept was that then you can build it out, make it your own. The They had the concept that every house was like a postage stamp on the lot, so it could be built out however you wanted. I mean, I'm obsessed with, if I could ever find an untouched Levitt, that would be the dream, just to tour it. But I mean, it's I could send you some of the ads, but it's crazy because they include like a free TV with, and people were using their VA loans to fund them. But what I'm getting at is, so I live in a Levitt house. I'm not in Levittown, but I'm Levittown adjacent. So, we'll get into this. I don't have a basement, but what's happening on Long Island is really these Levitts are getting torn down. I'm probably in one of the last, what we call like a flipped Levitt. I bought it in 2021. And now those are just getting torn down and turned into McMansions. So that's a really big thing. That's literally a big thing that's happening around here. Um, And no one seems to have that affectation or no, affection, sorry, for Levitt houses the way that I do. Maybe it's just because I'm not from here, but yeah.
Well, I really appreciate you sharing that anecdote because it's going to sort of directly tie into your preservation of history at
Yes.
Dino-Mite Vintage. But let's go back a little bit. From what I understand, you grew up in Minnesota,
Yep.
uh, um, and eventually went and studied art history at the University of Minnesota. And
Yes.
I'm curious about kind of like I just people listening to the show know that I am obsessed with this relationship between like youth and location and passions and like where those
Yeah.
sort of like Venn diagrams connect. And I'm curious, Gina, like when you were a kid, like what were your sort of like main interests, and then what kind of made you decide that art history was the span you wanted to explore?
Wow, you did your research. I'm really impressed. Let me think. I loved books and reading. I loved, I loved video games. Like I had a Nintendo from, my dad was a very early adopter of technology to a fault. Like we had a Betamax and had to go to the one video store that still had it for a year or so after. But yeah, so I liked doing that. I liked going to museums. I'm trying to think. Like I did theater, I guess, in high school. Like I played in the band. I loved music. I mean, I still do, but I got really into, rock and roll. And, my dad had a lot of really good. I mean, when I think about the fact I think my brother has all those albums, but they must be worth so much money now because he had the, Velvet Underground with the banana like sticker still on it. And I mean, my God. So yeah, that kind of stuff. And yeah, and then I started getting into kind of history and older things. And I think this was just this buried memory of that until like I was interviewed by Patch. And it was for eighth grade Halloween. I went and, I went to one of these really cool stores in uptown Minneapolis. Like uptown was the cool part, at least back then. And, got like this 60s shift dress and dressed as like a 60s person. And then I don't know, I eventually that just became normal wardrobe and it kind of went from there.
That's awesome. I read that article and just
Yeah.
like the fact that Halloween basically became like the way in which you dressed normally. Just love
It
that.
totally is. And it's so funny because when I like most drag queens have that origin story as well. Where they're like, I dressed up for it for Halloween kind of as a joke, and then now I'm a drag queen full time. And so yeah, that's kind of yeah, that's what it became.
And what about that sort of that interest in like really digging deep into where these things came from and whatever, like that sort of interest in art history? Like when did that kind of start to get its hooks into you?
Um, well, I mean, casually I was thrifting and stuff since I was probably 16. But art history, I fell into it. I did not plan that. I graduated high school with like almost a year's worth of credit at the University of Minnesota. And I really had planned on being a poli sci major. And then, I was really active in like the Democratic Party when I was in high school. And then my first kind of official poli sci class that I took was just, it and this is just a lifelong problem for women, but it was just, like a Socratic method kind of thing where it was just a bunch of dudes talking to each other. And I had signed up for like a modern art history class just on a whim and loved it and loved learning history via the art. So I did specialize in 45 to the present and kind of went from there. There was one professor I really loved and took everything from her that I could. And yeah, I mean, I wrote my thesis early, I graduated early. I was just really ready to, I don't know, do things.
To go change the world. one
Yeah,
step at a
something like
time.
that. Yeah.
And it led you, if I understand correctly, you went to St. Catherine's University in St. Paul,
Yes.
to study library science. What was that sort of transition like to decide, like, all right, I'm learning all the things, and now I'm going to learn how to organize all the things?
Well,
Like,
I actually, right after college, I took an internship in New York City. Actually, I lived in New York for a summer. I was working at, I don't know if it's still called this, but it was the Pace McGill Gallery on 57th Street. It was a photography gallery. They represented like Lauren Greenfield and David Byrne and William Wegman, like a lot of really cool stuff. So I kind of had this, plan that I'm like, oh, I'm gonna go work at a gallery. And then, I was very hand to mouth during that time. I was living in Brooklyn and I was working at Starbucks every morning from 5 to 9, down the street from my internship, and then going to the so you know, it was a lot. And I'm not going to say, oh, New York is too fast paced or something like that, but I think and I've seen this happen to other people, and I'm sure other people can attest to this, but it made me just so tense and angry. And there was this day where, because I thought like, oh, I can, there was like an opening in, I think, William Wegman's studio and maybe like another one, David Burns. And I just was like, there was one day getting off work and I wasn't in a rush to get anywhere. It was just a summer day and I was about to get on the subway and there was this elderly nun walking up the stairs. And my first instinct was, I need to push this woman down the stairs because she's going too slow. And then I was like, oh my God, like who am I? And so I had I had library school kind of in my back pocket because I when I was in college, I started there's the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, really good modern art gallery museum. And um I'd sort of been doing this too. Like the librarian took me under her wing, like she loved me. And so I was doing an internship with her once a week, filing ephemera. And I was like, oh, what does it take to be a librarian? And she's telling me like you have to go to grad school. I'm like, that sounds boring. But then that's what I ended up doing. I moved back to Minnesota and went to library school. So yeah.
that's really cool. And I just, going back to your anecdote about the nun, I think that's like a moment that almost all New Yorkers have,
Right?
where I've got a friend who, upstate New York, Syracuse specifically, has, a lot of people feel that it has kind of a Midwestern vibe.
Yeah.
Kindness is around. Some people will dispute it, but please, thank you, and holding doors tend to be
Right.
commonplace. And one of my friends was up here for a while and was doing that, and then took the train down, and like within moments of stepping foot into Grand Central Station, was like ready to just run a marathon against all the slow
It
pokes
is.
holding tote bags, and was like, this is I okay, it's the upstate New Yorkness has left my body in under 10 minutes.
It seriously was like, I mean, it's like that. And oh my gosh. Yeah. I just remember like walking around with all this like stress and anger all the time. Not that any of, that certainly I'm in, I'm on Long Island. It's not like this is some sort of Shangri-La where everyone's nice to each other. But yeah, yeah, at least I'm not yeah, to be more eloquent about it, I did not like the person I was becoming in New York City.
I'm proud of you for trying to grow, Jaina. Good work.
Thank you.
So you went to St. Catherine University, and then ended up moving to Connecticut to take your first librarian job, if I
Yep.
understand correctly.
Yeah,
Um,
I had one job before I left in it was at a for-profit music college that is now defunct.
is
But
McNally Smith.
yeah, look at you. But yeah, it was the mid 2000s were under, Tim Pawlenty, the governor, who, I mean, after politics in the last few years, it's like I have almost an affect, I have like almost an affection. Oh yeah. But he combined all the library um counties and stuff into one system. So there was a bunch of people laid off. And even if there was a new job, there was this, list of people to offer it to first. And so yeah, my friends and I in library school we all either took jobs at for-profit colleges or these kind of like back room reference assistant kind of jobs to work our way up. And so, yeah, I just decided to start applying wherever. And um, kind of teen librarianship was just starting to be a thing in, the mid to late 2000s. And so I had been, listening to this episode of This American Life and about this librarian in Michigan who was a teen librarian and had been planning rock shows and things like that. And I connected with him, and he kind of mentored me through the process of becoming a teen librarian. And then those are the jobs I applied to, and I, got offered a job in Connecticut and offered a job in Washington, Tacoma, Washington, the same week, and took Connecticut. And yeah, I was there for 13 years.
It was the magnetic pull of that nun. Just like, you need to come and make
Exactly,
up for it.
exactly. I had to make it up to her. Like, I had
So,
to.
how do I say this? I'm just foreshadowing. I know that you ended up kind of developing an unhealthy relationship with your work life, and we'll come to that in a minute.
Yeah.
But I'm curious about, your time kind of doing the teen librarian thing, and like what those sort of day-to-day operations look like, and what kind of like excited you about, that role, doing the librarian thing, what's kind of making it.
I think, um, I was good at it, so I hate to make a statement like this, but, um, it's never my goal to be a teen librarian forever. I wouldn't say like, "Oh, that was my passion." I've never read the Harry Potter books, which is crazy, but, they just were coming out with the last one as I was starting, and no one was gonna come in and be like, "Oh, is Harry Potter good?" So I had to start, like, hitting the ground running with, like, Twilight and stuff like that, and, yeah, like, it wasn't teen stuff wasn't necessarily my passion, but, I was able to work the reference desk, which I loved, and I did, like, video game stuff. I got, like, a black market Wii when I first started because like, you still couldn't just walk into a store and buy them. So I got, like, a really expensive one on eBay, and then that was basically, like, 2 years of programming was me, taking that to the senior center and doing weekly stuff, and so I was able to incorporate some of my passions into it. Um, but, it was never my goal to do that forever, and I will say, like, I think teen librarianship, like YA librarianship has a shelf life. Once when you're in your mid-20s and stuff, I mean, you're basically still a teenager yourself, you can relate to the kids, and then once you get into your late 30s or so, it's, at least for me, that role was almost, yeah, it was librarian, but it was almost like guidance counselor and event planner and things like that. And when I started to get to the point where I couldn't really relate to the kids anymore, um, yeah, I wanted to transition out of that role. And there are definitely people who do it forever because they have this like passion for young adult literature. Um, and that wasn't me. So yeah.
When you were just going back, when you were at St. Catherine, did you have a specific sort of like angle that you were trying to make for yourself in regards to like
Um,
what type of librarianship you were really excited about?
I never took a public library class. Um, you know, I I ended up taking mostly cataloging courses because at the time that I was at McNally Smith, I was doing the cataloging. I was really starting their library somewhat from scratch, and I had to get it in shape for their accreditation. So, yeah, I was taking classes that helped me learn how to do original cataloging. And, it was a very solo kind of job. I was just listening to podcasts all day and cataloging. So I was just taking those things that could help me. But yeah, I never took a public librarianship course. There was a medical librarianship class I really wanted to take, and it was always full. Like I never took a lit course. I mean, I was there treating it like a trade school, and honestly, that is what library school is. It's it's a trade school. It's a means to an end to get the degree to get yourself in the door. I mean, I'm not saying it's not helpful or good, but yeah. And that's what I treated it like.
Well, and I think, one of the things that is just important, and, just, I don't know, full transparency, like I teach in a computer science department, and I teach information science classes specifically. And we oftentimes have students who then go
Yeah.
and get their MLS through there and whatnot.
Yeah.
And it's always interesting to me, just like from the sort of educational background standpoint, like the idea that I firmly believe that libraries in our country are very important, and I believe that
Yeah.
if you don't think they're important, you probably haven't stepped in one in a while, and it's good just
Absolutely.
to step in a library and just see how many people it's servicing and how many lives are changing moment by moment. Like they're really important. They're really important resources, but on the flip side too, in order to have some of our most important and functional resources work, you have to have people who are all on the same page and are reading, understanding the same manuals and understand the same systems and all come from the same background.
Yeah.
And oftentimes that can just be really dry.
Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
so
Absolutely. And I mean, I'm sure you've dealt with I mean, not to get too boring, but like Library of Congress subject headings. Do you like they're fixed and a lot of them go out of date pretty fast. It might have changed since then, but at least when I was an active librarian, if you wanted to find like the Library of Congress was still using the word like aeroplane or cookery. So yeah, so it was like a skill set just to learn how to work backwards from those subject headings when you are looking up books um and yeah, like the Dewey Decimal System is great. Uh so yeah, it's a shared knowledge, and yeah, it can get pretty nerdy, and that part I did like.
I want to follow up on one thing you said earlier before we kind of
Mhm.
transition out of this, which is you talked about, I love the term black market we, by the way.
Yes, thank you.
That might be my favorite term of the day.
Yes.
As just as a video game dweeb. But
Right.
it's like the sort of additional programming that librarians do, I think, is often not part of the narrative when we talk about, librarians and their work.
No.
And you mentioned buying that and then taking it to senior centers and things like that. Can you tell us a little bit more about like what that part of your job ended up becoming and kind of how you used something like a Nintendo Wii to bring people together?
Well, it was I was the only person on staff of my age group. The other people, there were some people like a little bit older than me, but they were still 10 years older. So I mean, I came into that job 26 years old, um, knowing like I didn't know, I didn't know anything because I was 26 and you think you know all the things and you don't. But I think it was a couple things. It was, the director at the time was really excited about, having like cool new programming and things like that. And then also, I did have to justify the fact that I spent half my budget within the first couple weeks buying, $500 Wii. So I definitely got the use out of that. And what was interesting, and I don't know if this I don't know if this model would work the same, but um, at the time, because it was like this black market weed, because no one else could get it, I was working in a really wealthy community. Um, so it was a strange opportunity to offer a toy or a piece of technology that these kids didn't have access to. So if they wanted to play Wii, they had to come to the library. And that was really how I used it kind of to begin with. And then, yeah, and like, yeah, I took it to the senior center. I took it to the Y. I took it all over. I mean, I definitely wrecked a projector at the library because I was, I plugged it in directly to the projector too many times. But, if you remember when the Wii came out, it was this like, uh, you know, and it really was kind of like a gateway sort of gaming system. So people that, you know, older people that were like, video games are bad, the fact that you're like, here, you just hold this controller and you can pretend to bowl or, um, like that Wii Sports was, I mean, now if you put either of us in front of Wii Sports, we'd be like, okay, like, but at the time, my God, it was insane and so fun.
If by put us both in front of Wii Sports, you mean we'll both get winded really quickly? I think that might be
Yeah,
what you're alluding to.
we're old and like we'd be like, I'd rather maybe go real bowling where I can have a beer and like a hot dog, like that kind of thing. But yeah,
I have a very vivid memory of my 95-year-old grandma having no idea how any of these things worked, and us sitting there playing Wii baseball one day,
yeah,
and her it was like the first time she had kind of understood that like, oh, like me making this motion or having this can have something directly interactive with the TV,
right.
and I just always thought that was like such a cool thing. Like it was a
It
really fun
is.
memory.
It totally is. And like my gosh, I haven't thought about that for so long. And yeah, and some of those games too were like that original like WarioWare game, like was so fun. And like I can't, it's not they haven't ported that over to the Switch. The newest Wario game was sort of reminiscent of that, but like just I mean, not to get too off topic, but like that first Wario game was so fun. It was like the best use of those Joy-Cons was like to pick a guy's nose or it was so fun.
Oh man, this is getting out of hand, but we're going to keep it here for at least another
Yes, yes,
minute.
yes.
So for listeners out there who are completely unsure of what the heck we're talking about, which I'm assuming you know what the Nintendo Wii is, but I'll explain it anyway. Which was it
Yes,
was
thank you.
Nintendo's console that came out. That was the first kind of console that just said, you know what, peripherals are what we're going to give you. So instead of a traditional game controller, it was really sweet because, like, from a marketing standpoint, Nintendo, who had been struggling in the market against Microsoft and Sony, released this system that was like antithetical to everything else that was going on. They're like, hey, we're going to be the family friendly system and you're going to get physical activity by doing this, by
Yeah.
playing our games, which is cool. But WarioWare Smooth Moves
Yep.
was a game that was nothing but weird mini games that would be like 5 to 7 seconds long. It was like
Okay.
go and pick up the thing, or move this in a certain way. Or one of my favorite ones was the way you moved it was the same way that somebody would move their hand, and you had to make it so they smoothly drank a glass of water.
Oh my gosh, I was so bad at that one.
Yeah, it was pretty
I mean,
fun.
I'm
So
bad at it in real life too, but
but I
it's
it's cool. It's cool though, just in the sense that like when we think about, the amount of money that people spend on occupational therapy, and if you're somebody who is in a senior center and you're having a hard time finding, new ways to move, bringing this as a librarian, not as a,
yeah,
occupational therapist, to be like, hey, everybody, I know that your grandkids play video games and they're distractions, but like, let's try them here. And all of a sudden you're getting people to move their bodies in a way where they're no longer thinking about actually what they can or can't do. They're just excited to reach the digital obstacle. And I think that's a really cool thing for you to be able to do, especially when like you're young and you're in your career and you're
yeah,
basically justifying like, I know I'm young, I know I don't know how budgets work, but this is going to be a worthwhile investment for our department.
absolutely. And then so many of those kids who came in to play games then were comfortable at the library and used it as a resource to, for homework and as a place to study. And I definitely, I will take credit. Like I brought up that first kind of full group of kids that came through. And yeah, I still talk to some of them like they were my students and um and all of that, also led me to having kids of my own because I didn't wasn't like a person that dreamt about having children as a kid or anything, but then in working with them, it's yeah, I loved it and I love playing Nintendo with my son and yeah.
Well, let's jump into this, and I'll be upfront that I try to keep the show as sort of positive in general, but sometimes we just got to talk about life. And in
Yeah,
2015, you had your first son, and from what I understand, the pregnancy horrendous, problematic, difficult,
that was
eye-opening
my
seems to be
second
the
son.
theme. Oh, your second son. I'm sorry.
No, no, it's okay.
Um,
Like 2015, I had my oldest and that pregnancy went smoothly. Like that was fine. But it was 2017. Yeah. So started bleeding, and not to get too into it, like you can do a disclaimer or whatever, but like 20 weeks, and the doctors didn't know what was wrong. I basically was going to the hospital or the doctor every couple days because I was like, there's something wrong. This isn't normal. And I ended up just moving into the hospital at 26 weeks pregnant. And I had to be on bed rest starting at 20 weeks. And being on bed rest, I mean, my God, that was my first time not working in my entire adult life. I was always, even in college, like I had two or three jobs at once. I always had an internship and another job. And yeah, it was my first time just to chill, I guess, and be alone with my thoughts. And I couldn't even really actively take care of my oldest because I had to be in bed rest. And then yeah, like I said, I moved into the hospital at 26 weeks. So I had like a little fridge in my room. I got myself like a fire stick and um that kind of thing. But yeah, I had to keep as calm as possible. I just kind of disassociated a lot. And then yeah, like I was able to keep him in till 30 and a half weeks. And then he was in the NICU for 45 days. I had a placental abruption, which is pretty rare. I think I saw it like in an episode of Grey's Anatomy or something, but it's where when your uterus is expanding, the placenta detaches from the uterine wall. So, and that can be entirely or just a little bit. And I think mine was just enough to cause a lot of problems. And so, I mean, he was fine. Like the only thing that was wrong with him was that he was born early, and that was my thing. So, he's fine, he's thriving, it's good. But yeah, he was born in September. And yeah, we had to keep him home for 6 months, except just to go to doctor's appointments. So, we had a visiting nurse like twice a week to come and weigh him. It's flu season. So yeah, so even like I was on maternity leave, and then I kind of started to go back. I started going back to work like part-time, like 3 days a week or so, beginning of, like January 2018. And it was then that it just wasn't the same. I, I think like when I was in the hospital and I had all this time to think, um, I thought, oh, like, librarianship is so important to me and I love helping people. And then it was kind of like when I got back, um, it was weird. Like so much just changed when I had a doctor's note to say that I need to come back part-time. That it was basically saying I can come back to work, right? And I had the pediatrician write the note, and she originally wrote it as like, oh, Jaina still needs time off for pregnancy or whatever. And I was like, no, I need it to say basically that I need to be home part-time to take care of Teddy because he's so, she also wasn't my OB, so it made sense. And so I guess when she left the original note under the one that said, oh, Teddy needs to get taken care of, and I had this big like intervention in the director's office with HR because they acted like I had made up the first note, that I had like almost like had pregnancy problems. And I was like, no, that's not it. I'm like, I'm getting a note so I can come back to work because I really want to be back at work. And um yeah, and after that point, it wasn't the same. I I did not have the same passion for it. I did not, um, I just, and so much of my experience I thought was my library. And then everyone else I've talked to who works in public libraries, their environments are all not great. So I know that it's more that than anything else. But, yeah, like, I mean, there was parts I loved. Like I was able to start doing children's librarian stuff. So I taught like a baby class, and stuff like that. But yeah, like that extinguished a lot of passion.
So I guess one of the things I'm kind of curious about, and I'm gonna apologize in advance, A, if this question doesn't come out right, and B, if this is too much of like a soul searchy question. Um, but like as kind of like talking to you right now, and then also kind of doing this research, like it's clear that that was kind of like a, I don't know, like this realization for you about like what you did want out of your life.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of curious about like like Midwestern grit is what you're just, I think you're describing,
Yeah.
where it's like, I am going to get the work done and I'm going to help people and I'm going to make sure that the way in which I carry myself is respectful and kind. And I'm going to do things that benefit the community, but maybe I take second fiddle to that. And then having all this time to kind of reflect, I'm curious about like, as you're thinking about kind of making your way out of the library system and kind of moving into whatever the next phase of your life is going to be, what did you have kind of a mission statement in your mind or like things where you're like, I need this to be a part of me, or I need to use my time this way? Like, was there sort of, I don't know, rules that were being developed in your head about what you kind of wanted to live by moving forward?
Um, I definitely, I mean, midlife crisis part one was I left that job and went back to school to be an archivist because I was really interested, and I mean, I still am obviously in history. Actually, my favorite thing I ended up doing when I was a teen librarian, in the latter part of that career path, was I started working with kids on History Day projects. Do you know what National History Day is?
Enlighten me, please.
Okay, I'm like, you look nerdy enough. I mean that in like the best way possible that but it's every year this organization picks a topic and it's usually broad like you know stand you know like I'm trying to think of some of the examples of like conflict and compromise in history. And so there were all these different categories where kids could make like a poster or like a documentary or write a paper. And so I helped kids. I did like personal research appointments for them with I worked with the AP Social Studies department and helped them really develop those research plans and worked really closely with some like especially this one girl who was working on a documentary, and it was just so good. And I realized in doing that so much of there's so much of history that wasn't accessible because it wasn't digitized. And even when you think about like this isn't something I thought about until I was learning about it, but even like reading cursive handwriting is a lost art. And even I mean, even those of us who can read cursive, like a lot of old-timey cursive, you can't. And so I was seeing the importance of these organizations that were not only digitizing things, but also, you know, like putting it in regular, like a regular PDF to accompany the, you know, handwritten document or um and yeah, and my library had a lot of really great stuff. And we were just there was always a building renovation on the horizon. So we were always tasked with um, weeding, which is the librarian term for, getting rid of books. And, and that's kind of the dark secret or whatever of librarianship. And it shouldn't be, because most of the books that you're weeding out need to be, if something is outdated or, has like someone, wipe their nose with it, or it's just, there's a lot of stuff, but you had to kind of do it in secret because there's just this, you know, stigma against, because of book burning and everything. And I get that, but like throwing away the Windows 95 guide isn't quite the same as like banning a book. But people see that just because it's written word. So, but then we were actually weeding out stuff that was cool. It was like these city directories from, the 1900s, and there was a historical society in town. But yeah, I became very interested in yeah, preserving things and also making them accessible to everyone. And so that became sort of a shift for me, was doing that more than yeah, more than like event planning and stuff like that. So
And you
that
called that midlife crisis part one?
part one, yes, number one. And then this, where I'm at right now, is midlife crisis part two.
I love it. So
Yeah.
you ended up stepping away from librarianship. If I doing it seemed like you did some freelance stuff for a little while, or at least you offered that.
Yeah.
Um, which is pretty cool. And then truly devoted yourself to vintage. Having moved to Long Island, um, and living in your Levitt house, and doing all those types of things. You had mentioned that like you have been kind of thrifting and doing all that stuff forever. Um, but how did you kind of get to the point where you decided that like being a reseller was something that you wanted to put your time and effort into?
Um, well, yeah, I had been freelancing. So yeah, I finished my archival certification, doing classes remote. I took 6 months off because of, COVID and being home with kids full time. But yeah, so I had a lot of big projects I was doing. I was like one of the head researchers for this documentary that's out. I think it's available on Amazon now. It's like um about Carol Doda, who was the first topless dancer in San Francisco. And that was important. Like, I was able to do all that research remotely, because things were digitized really well, and find interviews for people and all of that. But um yeah, so I was doing that, and then um so this is like a wayward answer, but I'm sure you're okay with that. So I guess this was summer of 2022. Um, there was like a little bit of a drought going on here, and the grass in my front yard just was not growing. And this is the third house I've owned, and I wouldn't say I'm, like a super environmentalist, but I believe in kind of being selective about it to sort of justify other things. It's like, I use disposable diapers and stuff like that, but like, let's find that balance to cut back somewhere else. And so ever since I was a homeowner, I was looking into, clover lawns and things like that. And even like clover was not growing. So I started making a rock garden, and I started with one segment. And then in, ADHD fashion, just kept going. And that started me with kind of thrifting again, because I was going to thrift stores and estate sales and garage sales and things like that for, um, things I could upcycle. And I mean, if this is a weird thing, but rocks are really expensive. If you've ever bought rocks for your front yard or something, um, it's a lot of money. So I was like dumpster diving for rocks. I found anytime on Facebook Marketplace or something like that, I was going to people's houses and just digging them out of the yard. Found a I found like a quarry that had an alley that had like rejected rocks. I was like putting them in my trunk. I mean, it was crazy.
So
So
wait, that I just want to clarify. That quarry was weeding their rocks?
they were weeding their rocks. Yes. Yes. It was like this stonemasonry kind of place. And there was a garbage dump next door. And for some reason, then there was this alley between them where it was probably like failed masonry projects. Like, I have some big rocks in my front yard that have some, like grooves in them from when you could tell it was like, oh, it was supposed to fit into a wall or something. But yeah, I was going there on a weekly basis and just filling up my car. Like, there was definitely a time, I went to some guy's house who just had gravel in his backyard, and I was like, okay, I mean, it's so random to think of all the weird side quests I did to get rocks and planters and things like that. But yeah, it became this like dinosaur themed rock garden, and I did it all myself, like every single part. I learned how to, you know, layer it correctly, and it's I've never had it flood or slide off or anything. And then I filled in with native plants where I could, um and now, yeah, that's kind of what really started it. Was I was going to all these places, um and then I started making like weird Christmas wreaths because I had done the only like tools or things I really used in the yard were zip ties and floral wire. So I had been already doing these kind of dinosaur things with floral wire, and yeah, and then I started selling wreaths that Christmas, and did some vendor pop-ups, and then it just kind of went from there. That I was, you know, then I got into, like, I started in Etsy. I had always been kind of selling on Poshmark, but then I started selling more on Poshmark, and yeah, and it just became a whole thing.
And and please correct me if I'm wrong, but was the first company that you, or the first kind of, I don't know, resale company that you
Mhm.
created called Big Goods Adventure?
Big Adventure Goods.
Big Adventure Goods,
Yep.
sorry.
Yep.
And that may or may not be related to a favorite movie of yours.
Yes, it's very related to Pee-wee's Big Adventure. And yeah, the logo was the dinosaurs in the movie, and yeah, and so that was it. And yeah, and then I started doing um
Can I just
you know
interject real quick? One of the things that
absolutely.
when you and I had messaged back and forth, I
Yeah.
asked you about things that you're obsessed with, and you're like, Pee-wee's Big Adventure, like
Yes.
just overview. But the one thing that I find kind of interesting is I love when there's weird themes between things, but like you basically create this sort of Pee-wee's Big Adventure like dinosaur rock garden
Yep.
because you don't want to water your lawn. Pee-wee's Big Adventure is directed by Tim Burton. Tim Burton also directs Edward Scissorhands,
Yep.
which is all about suburbia and people watering their lawns. Like there's just a weird kind of like Tim Burton-y sub narrative that
Yeah.
has made this whole thing float to the top, which I think is pretty cool.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, and like and two, I mean, like ever since I was a homeowner and I had to start paying for water, I was like, look, I don't want to pay for water to water grass. Like that's so boring. You know? Like I'll do it for flowers or vegetables or something like that. Or I'm not like some sort of, I take showers, and I'm not like some water preservationist necessarily, but it just was like it seemed like such a waste of time and water to me when, yeah, like I didn't water my lawn all summer, and I had sunflowers come up. And so my
Awesome.
rock garden was now a sunflower garden. And um yeah, that was, yeah, and eh, it's very like this has nothing to do with anything, but I guess maybe it's like this one weird kind of like little hipster quality of me that I'm very specific to, yeah, like I like Pee-wee's Playhouse, but I'm very specific that I like Pee-wee's Big Adventure. That's my thing. Just like I got really into P.T. Barnum. I mean I still am, but I always was like not the circus, the American Museum. Like
There's nothing wrong with niche stuff. So I'll throw
yeah,
this out there. So for listeners out there who need homework assignments, it sounds like
yeah,
watching Pee-wee's Big Adventure, for the niche love of Jaina is a good way to go. And if you need a
absolutely.
niche love of Ryan Zlomek, he is obsessed with Gremlins 2. So the
Oh
double
my God.
feature of Gremlins 2 and Pee-wee's Big Adventure might be what you need this weekend. You're welcome.
Ab Absolutely. Oh my gosh, we haven't rewatched, like, I showed my youngest, who was my premature one, like, he is so into spooky stuff. Like, we just did this Disney trip and Universal trip in LA to do a bunch of haunted houses and stuff like that. But I showed him Gremlins last year, and it was kind of this like Stefan SNL, 'cause he's like, this movie has everything. It's like it's gross and it's cute and it's spooky. And I was like, yes. So we still actually need to watch Gremlins too. I mean, I've seen it, but
Uh,
yeah.
when you do, I look forward to that review. Um,
Absolutely.
but for listeners who are hoping to learn about vintage, we'll get back to the main subject,
Yes,
shall
yes,
we?
yes.
So I'm curious about like before big adventure goods you do after this sort of rock garden thing, and then eventually you get to a point where you open a brick and mortar, and we'll get to that momentarily. But I'm curious about like how your sort of mentality shifts or how your approach to things shifts when you go from like I'm gonna go thrifting so I can find cool stuff for my kids or for me to wear or for my super rad dinosaur rock garden,
Hmm.
to all of a sudden thinking about the consumer and thinking about the fact that like there is somebody at some point who needs to open their wallet to be able to give back to you. Like, how does your sort of approach to thrifting and hunting things down change once you start to do that?
Um, well, it's kind of this cyclical sort of thing because when I first started really doing it and starting the reselling, I was finding all these really cool vintage sheets. And I just started getting them because they were like $2 or $3. And I'm like, these seem important. And I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to sell them. And then I actually found this like vintage linen group on Facebook, and the woman who runs it like mentored me into becoming, I guess, a sheet seller, and taught me how, there's like a actual vintage sheet database. It was just the nerdiest specific thing I could do. And no one else was doing it at the time, at least around here. So I became kind of that was like my first specialization was vintage sheet specialist. So I started selling vintage sheets at pop-ups and stuff. And I'm there was there's kind of like there are actual like vintage linen collectors. And then there's people who upcycle them into dresses and things like that. So I was catering a lot, I mean, to both of those groups. And um yeah, and I loved it. Like I still don't know how to sew. I mean, I have a machine I haven't opened. But I think so much of it, at least at the beginning and now as well, was saving like women's labor. Um, you think about the invisible labor of women and families, and especially around here, all the, these are people who lived in these houses since the 50s, and people die, and then everyone's like, okay, like just throw this all out, or and there were so many, like beautiful, beautiful tablecloths and things like that where you could just tell that these were dinner parties where women never sat down. The things were so well cared for, but because it was just a tablecloth, it didn't have that same value as someone buying, the record collection or something like that. So that kind of became the first focus. And I think too, when I was working on the rock garden, it was about upcycling and reusing things. And um somewhere in that transition to becoming a vintage seller, um, I learned how to sell it. There's a big difference between, going and just buying stuff for myself, because I don't care if something has a chip in it, or when people ask like what do I personally collect, it's like I love finding ceramics where someone just messed up the eyes. Like where everything's perfect until you get to like someone, like I've got a looking at it right now, I have like a wolf with like cross eyes, like a ceramic, stuff like that, where it's just like something's a little bit wrong. Um, Love that. And people like kids like pottery, like bad pottery, like love it. But that wasn't, what really sold. And so I did get, getting into the vintage scene or whatever, realizing like, no, 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 like it's about perfection. Like you have to find something that is unbroken, unstained, unmarred. And and then so yeah, I started selling at vintage stores and vintage markets. And yeah, it was, I loved it, but that was definitely a thing that I kind of struggled with, was like what's happening to all these things that aren't perfect. Um, and yeah, that was a big learning experience. And it's still it still is. Like I still buy things that I'm like, "Ah, it has a stain on it," and then I, put it in a pile to do the laundry or something. But yeah, that
So
was I lost the thread of the question somewhere in there,
no,
but
no, no, it's okay.
yeah.
It was about the way in which you change your kind of like buying and searching habits,
Yeah. Yeah, so that was
based on customer like or what you perceive customers will want.
absolutely. Absolutely. And like, you look it up and see what things are worth and learning that difference between what is something worth, what are people actually willing to pay for it, who actually wants it, that kind of stuff.
Well, so I don't mean to jump ahead in the narrative
I'll do it.
too succinctly, but like you end up opening Dino-Mite Vintage
Mm-hmm.
in Wantagh or Wantagh,
Wantagh, yeah.
uh New York. It says what soft opening on Memorial Day in 2021.
Mm-hmm.
And you're rocking it. Like you've got this cool shop that continues to find, I don't want to say niche
Yeah.
uh carryings, but like it's a vintage store that specializes um in clothing and toys, but also like you specifically try to hunt down vintage clothing for plus size women,
Yep.
because there's not a lot of places that are doing that are
Yeah,
searching for those
absolutely.
things. You've maintained your passion for linens and bedding, which I think is really
Yeah.
interesting. And have turned it also into kind of a gathering place. But tell us about like leading up to the opening of Dino-Mite Vintage. Like, what made you decide that brick and mortar was the way you wanted to transition this project? And then tell us about kind of like opening shop and like getting everything ready.
Um, well, I had a like what I'd say is like the life-changing event was in January. I did this pop-up called Totally Rad Vintage Fest in New Jersey. And I mean, to bring it back, the company is based out of Minneapolis and it's a traveling vintage market. So they did an East Coast tour and I did it and I met my kind of current best friend there and it was so great because it was everyone there was basically younger who was shopping. It was like a lot of Gen Z and which is it was a very different crowd than these vintage markets. Um and I everyone who came to the booth was so enthusiastic and had plans for things. It wasn't like, "Oh, this is this perfect vase and I'm just going to put it on a shelf and look at it." It was, "Oh, I'm a fashion designer and I'm going to buy these sheets and make them into something." Or I like to sell those old recipe cards, the old Betty Crocker ones where all the food kind of looks awful, but I'm sure it's not. Um, and so, people would be like, I'm going to hang this up in my dorm or I'm going to um and then I guess this is probably a theme. Like I went immediately from that 2-day pop-up to going to Mexico for a week where all I did was like sit around. And then having that time to reflect, I realized, oh, maybe I should start looking into this. Because two, I mean, I have no basement. I had multiple storage units because I had so much stuff and I was just um like I was carrying stuff for pop-ups, I was carrying stuff for other people's stores, and it just kind of got to the point where I'm like, okay, I'm spending X amount a month on space that I can't use. And so why don't we start thinking about, usable space? Because I do like fixing stuff up too. I like spray painting and um, that kind of stuff. And so I was like, well, that will get it out of my backyard. And um, yeah, so that I started really looking in earnest kind of when I got back. So in, kind of February, March, were devoted to that. And there was a space I really did like that was smaller and more affordable. And then I had no business experience and it was like a bunch of white guys in Connecticut that owned it and as an investment and they didn't want to take a chance on me until later they did because no one else was getting it. But yeah, I did not mean to spend this much money every month, but I had asked a friend at the time who'd had a brick and mortar before to like come look at things with me just because he had more experience. And then you know, he told me he talked me into a bigger space because he said, you know, I'd love to get in, you know, I'd love to be your vendor and like I can go in on this for $1,000 a month with you. And then eventually bailed on me. And so and this was after I, you know, spent $8,000 on floors to his specifications and you know, and everything became very last minute because I was waiting to do kind of the final setup for the store until he could come and set up his part of the record, you know, his record store. I have the word vinyl in my logo and like I don't really sell it anymore. So that's been, you know, a struggle is then I have this really big space. It had been rented out as two separate spaces. It was at least the front where I have the store, was like a vape shop when I first got it. So I, you know, had to, I call it de-vaping. You know, I took all the black, you know, shelving down. I, you know, got professional painters. I got a new floor. Everything else I've done myself, um, you know, on my own. But those were the two, you know, I was 20 grand deep, you know, starting. And I think a lot of people don't, you know, think about that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, so I mean, but I did want a bigger space because I want to be able to do pop-ups and I want to be able to do, you know, crafting classes and things like that. And now I'm finally getting that on track to start doing all that.
That's super cool. Being a business owner myself, like I think that a lot of people are like, oh, well, you opened here, you just started making money, right? I'm like, well, you've disregarded the 3 months it took us to get the space
LOL.
ready
Yeah.
to go, you know?
Hmm.
So I really appreciate you just being transparent about that because I think that a lot of like we're in a society right now where instant gratification is at an all-time high and it's only gonna get faster, right? That's just the
Right.
nature of things. But part of that is that we been thinking about this a lot, like the fact that we kind of start to disregard the fact that like when I'm checking my package delivery for USPS and I'm like, well, it left this morning, why isn't it here now? Like that's a person's data that I'm following. Um,
Exactly.
and when I'm looking at a business where I'm like, well, they don't really have what I want, or like, I don't think that's going to be for me. Like, you're talking about months and months and months of somebody's life that they put to make things look just this certain way. Taking 30 seconds to just take it in and say, you know what, I appreciate this. This must have taken a
Yeah.
lot of work, is an important thing to do. And especially if I hope everybody has aspirations to do something bigger than themselves. But sometimes, the best way to learn how to do that is to just do it and be like, oh, I have been so unappreciative of so many other businesses.
Absolutely. Like, oh my gosh, the amount, not that I did this on a regular basis, but you know, when you're not a business owner, you feel like you're being so helpful when you give advice. You're like, oh, you should carry this or this. And it's like, you know, I get all that. And then it's like, okay, so basically what you're saying is you want this to be a completely different store. You know, like, or you want this to be this or that. And then I'm like, you know, this place has that. Like, I'm happy to refer you. Because I really did want to specialize and I really did want it to be cohesive in the vision and not, I call it kind of maximalist minimalist where it's colorful, but it's still very, it's not visually overwhelming. Um, it's kid friendly. That was really important to me. It's not, I don't call it a kid store necessarily, but you know, there's nothing breakable within reach. I have a play area that, you know, kids can play stuff. So at least, you know, as a parent, you know, your entire life becomes about doing stuff with your kids, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but I it's a thing that doesn't really occur to you. Like I was out to dinner with you know, my fiance's family at one point, you know, a couple years ago, and his, you know, we're at like Chili's, you know, at 5 o'clock at night, not like, um, not anything crazy, but you know, I think his dad was like, "There's everyone's bringing their kids everywhere." And then my sister-in-law was like, "'Cause we have, they have to." It's like, we could be alone in the 80s, like when we were like 7 years old. I remember like coming home from school by myself every day and like making a snack. And you can't you can't do that. Like, you so yeah, like maybe I don't want to bring my kids to Chili's or something, but yeah, I have to. Like that's children are far more part of society than they used to be because everyone's gotten, really high strung about children's safety and then people are also high strung about not wanting to see them or hear them and this I mean, my God, that's a whole other podcast. It's just all these parental expectations and um things like that. But, as a parent, um, you don't want your entire weekend just to be doing kid stuff. Like, and that was a huge thing was when I was restocking people's, other vintage shops and stuff, like I couldn't bring my kids because they were gonna break stuff. Not intentionally, but, you know, I would too. And so that was important to me that there's at least a space where like your kid isn't gonna be entertained all day, but if you wanna come and like look at clothes for 20, 30 minutes, there are dinosaurs for your kid to play with. Like you don't have to worry about them messing anything up. Like that's important to me.
Tell me about like so for how do I say this? Like as somebody who is structurally minded as you are, I mean I read at some point that you have a T-Rex tiki thing going on in a parking lot. Like
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
that's pretty cool. But tell us about like the way in which you made conscious choices about how you organize the space and display stuff within the space.
Yeah, I think so much of it is that thrift stores, look a certain way and vintage stores look a certain way and it's very much the same in just in different curation, but um it's usually very crowded uh with the shelving, everything's really crowded. Um and when you're neurodivergent, that can be very easily overwhelming. Um, unless you're like locked in and you're like, I'm gonna, seek this stuff out. But it's sometimes it's like that difference between going to like Target or Walmart, where Walmart has that kind of like Lord of the Flies sort of but then you go to Target and it's like, oh, it's like bright in here and things are colorful and you feel, you know, for a retail kind of immersive experience, like you you find yourself spending a lot more time there because it's easy on the eyes and the music's fun and things are spaced out really well. And I mean, Target's from Minneapolis, so but I guess when I started to sort of think about the stores and stuff where I felt, relaxed or engaged, those are probably the two biggest things you want, really, as a consumer or anyone who's going to a place. You want to feel relaxed but also engaged.
Yeah.
And so I started to think about that kind of stuff and what I would want. And again, like I'm very curated. I just do clothes, linens, dinosaurs, and basically that's it. I mean, I have some accessories. I have I don't even really do stray toys anymore. Like the toys I have are basically there for kids to play with. Like, I mean, because who doesn't love the idea of putting dinosaurs in a dollhouse or like a little people house? I mean, that's fun. So, uh, yeah, like I really, and I think coming from librarianship and everything too, like I want to know what I'm doing. Um, I value expertise and research and education. And so, yeah, like people are like, you should carry this or this. And I'm like, I don't know about comics. I don't know about, you know, I know about vintage video games and stuff like that. I don't know about them as a physical object. I wouldn't, would I love to have a pinball arcade in my back room? Absolutely. Would I know how to fix that? Absolutely not. So I want to know, yeah, I want to know what I'm doing. And when someone asks me a question, I want to be able to answer it with some degree of authority. And that's why yeah, I'm keeping it pretty limited.
Well, there's something to be said too about like whenever I kind of talk with young entrepreneurs or things like that, I'm like, well, what is your deal? Well, we're going to be something for everybody. And
Nope.
that rarely will work for you. I mean, like if we use Target as an example for, like one of their biggest marketing shifts, like about 15 years ago was to basically market almost exclusively to, new families. Like
Absolutely.
that's how they, so we think about like, oh, you go to Target and you find everything you want. Well, like in reality, the reason that you like that they have what you want is because like maybe that's where you went when you were like first expecting your first child or whatever, and like that, or you were a kid and your young parents were
Absolutely.
bringing you there. Like no matter how grandiose you think of a business model, oftentimes it really is a niche audience that then balloons into something bigger. And I guess what I'm kind of curious about for you, like to sit there and say like I am opening a store, it's going to be awesome, dinosaurs, linens, clothing,
Yeah.
plus size clothing,
Yep.
and maybe toys. Like, how have customers responded to your business model?
Um, Again, like I'm comfortable with that. It's not for everyone. I'm very comfortable with that. And again, like I mean, going off what you said, I think like the best retail experiences are not for everyone. Um, and so you know, I've been conscious about, you know, being, adapting to the community a bit and but a lot of people who so like half the people who walk in know me from Instagram or had seen, articles about me in the paper or something like that. Or were, followers, or I met them at a pop-up at some point and they get it. They come in for that. And then there's, a good at least once a day, there's someone just kind of like from the neighborhood, that just wants to see what it is. And or an older person that's like, oh, I have a bunch of great stuff. Like, you'll want to buy it. And I'm like, no, I don't do that. But so the reaction has been either people completely get it, they love it, they come back, they are, regulars or requesting things, or it's like they just don't understand. Like even though it says vintage, they're like, oh, all the clothes are used, all the, you know, so and that's okay. So it's figuring out even my own definition of vintage has changed because the main store I was selling at, everything had to be pre 1990. So if you had anything on the shelf that, they would take it off. And she had like a lot of rules and I appreciate those rules. But and I was following those. And then I was like, it's my own store. I can do what I want. Because when I first opened too, I really was modeling it after, the vintage stuff. The vintage stores I loved in my 20s. So, and how I shopped for vintage in my 20s, which was like, oh, I'm looking for 60s, 70s. And so I had mostly 60s, 70s stuff. And then I had one rack of Y2K, like reluctantly. And I had my friend curate it because, and then that's what started selling best. And so I have one rack now of what would be called true vintage, which is like the 60s to 80s, or um everything else is Y2K, or I'm even to the point where, I'm not buying fast fashion or anything, but I'm not, if something is high quality and used, I'm not necessarily caring if it's 5 or 10 years old. Because especially I've just realized that like the majority of people coming in don't care about that. They're not gonna call me out on, it's always that like fear of being like called a poser. You don't want to like wear the band t-shirt without like knowing more, the songs. And maybe that's coming from this like weird Gen X kind of culture of, you know, having to like defend yourself constantly to nobody. Um, God, isn't that like the best definition of Gen X?
I think it's pretty spot on.
Yeah. Like you just have to kind of, I mean, and I'm like in that cusp, I'm 44, so I'm in that like what did they call, you're around my age, right?
I'm a like a older millennial, I think is where I'm
That's a
at. So
yeah,
we're
like I think they called us Zennials, or it's kind of that like 1977 to 1983 is this kind of like no man's land. So yeah, I think the Gen X part of me is just like, no, like I have to know about this, and if it's a vintage shop, it has to be this certain way. And people from the town come in and they don't care if it's vintage. Like they're like, oh, this is like a hippie dress, I want that. Or um, it's, and there's really been, and you can really tell this huge difference between um clothing quality even from 10 years ago to now. And I've read articles about that, um just about how like with Sheen and everything, it's like it's all about like bulk purchasing and being as trendy as possible and mass producing so many things so quickly. um and how so much of it ends up in a landfill or blah blah blah. And I read something like in the in the 80s people bought an average of like maybe 20 pieces of clothing the entire year. And now, I mean, things are so cheap. And so anyone that makes this argument that like, oh, thrift stores are for the needy or poor people, it's like, no, they're more expensive than going to Walmart or Shein or something. So um just like that whole mentality has pushed down the quality of even places like J. Crew, or these kind of like higher Banana Republic, these kind of higher end chain stores. Everything is now just being produced as quickly and cheaply as possible with mostly polyester. And so yeah, it's crazy when you're thrifting, or you see something from like Old Navy from 10 years ago, it feels like a completely different garment. So that's kind of, yeah, that's a big part of this too, is like I don't necessarily care if it's vintage, but like, yeah, like an LL Bean flannel shirt broken in from 10 years ago is better than anything you're gonna get right now.
That's really interesting. Just in the sense that like I think like I don't know, one of the things I love about just kind of like growing an obsession about something is the fact that you start to like really see themes and start to have rules to kind of live by and observations that no one else has. So like that's a really interesting idea that like I mean, you're a vintage shop, and I'm not belittling that with this sentence, but like
No, no, no.
there's something to be said about like, yeah, okay, I'm called Dino-Mite Vintage, but in reality, like there's a quality that I'm choosing to represent, and that just happens to be to run like coincide with this sort of like Y2K vintage clothing operation. Like that's a cool way to think about things where it's like there's a level of quality that I adhere to, and it just happens to be of a certain time frame.
Absolutely. And yeah, and I think that's, I tread that middle ground. Because the area, I'm sure Cassie, our mutual friend, has talked about this. Like Long Island is New York, but it's its own planet. Um, as far as it can be concerned, it has this like it's like a conservative John Waters movie, if that makes sense. Like it's just everyone is kind of like, that's what I love about it though, because when I was in Connecticut, it's just so much more like puritanical and judgy, where it's like if I had, I felt comfortable having like one lawn ornament out on my yard. And now it's like, I don't know, it's this New Yorker thing around here that it's like if you're not bothering someone else, like you just leave them alone. But you will get into a physical altercation with someone over a parking space, or someone when it becomes, or someone cutting line or something like that. Like it's actually very refreshing as a Minnesotan to have like a verbal screaming match with somebody, because I'm like, that never happened back home. And I'm like, it's kind of it's exhilarating, but not every day. But um yeah, it's, so people leave you alone when you're, you want to have a dinosaur rock garden, like cool. As long as like my I'm not getting like roaches or something in your yard or, and they leave you alone. So so Long Island is yeah, like on the surface, again, it's very like John Waters. Like people are quirky and there's but at the same time it's conservative where I think like people have that respect. They're like, oh, if you're gay, that's your business. But I mean, everyone here is kind of gay. They just, I mean, if that makes sense, like everybody is like a little bit quirky, and I love that. But like, you can't really acknowledge the quirk, or so I think what I always say is my presence as a store in that neighborhood, by its very existence, is like girly and gay, but I don't lean into that too much. Like anyone that sees what the store looks like, or it's gonna be comfortable there, but to fit into the neighborhood and into the Chamber of Commerce and stuff, like I'm very conscious about like not putting a rainbow flag or something in the store window, or I'm very conscious about not being political in my postings or things like that, because I don't want to scare anyone away. And I think where I was going with this was there's a what I found is there's a Venn diagram, at least, um in there's a middle ground that you can reach between very liberal people and very conservative people, is that everybody can agree that you know making everything in China is not good. Either because everyone can agree, like, oh yeah, like quality of clothing was better 10 years ago. And you can appeal, obviously, to the left side with being like, this is an environmental thing, like, let's be sustainable. And again, you can appeal to the right side of being like, hey, like, do you remember like when this company was in America and this sweater was better? And um, so that's the middle ground I really like to be in. And I think, and two, I think when I was a librarian, I mean, that all comes from that. Like, my place isn't for everyone, but I also don't want to alienate anyone and make judgments or things like that. I want everyone to feel, safe and comfortable. And I mean, I'm next to like a Blue Lives Matter tiki bar. I call it the least gay tiki bar. Uh, like it's like if Jimmy Buffett had never gone on vacation and was a cop. If that makes sense. But like, but those people like watched out for me when I was working really late setting things up by myself, and like they get drunk and come over and buy Hawaiian shirts. So I mean, there's always just, like, I want to be part of the community and not, and that's, I think, such a huge difference between being a 44-year-old business owner, or if I opened this when I was 24. Um, so and that's the thing you learn in librarianship too, is kind of this covert service, like covert community service. Um, and I think that's kind of what I aim to be as well, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. You've gone from black market Nintendo Wii's to black
Yes,
market dinosaur community building. So
absolutely.
so Jana, I want to say you've been so generous with your time. I just
Oh
have
my God, yeah.
one last question for you before we start to wrap things up, which is obviously, like, I'm very fortunate that my listener base is global.
Yeah,
Like, I was counting today and I was like, this has been listened to in over 40 countries. Like, that's pretty rad.
yeah,
Unfortunately, not all of them are going to make it to Wantagh. So,
right.
what I'm curious about is, well, first things first, just, looking at your business, like, the other thing that I've seen, other than it's really heavily curated, it's focusing on specific things, and it's got this, like, I don't know, kind of beautiful narrative theme through it, is the fact that, like, your clothing is fairly affordable.
Hmm.
And it seems like that's a very intentional thing. I mean, I see a lot of resellers, vintage or otherwise, that are only gonna buy something if they can make 10,000 times whatever they invested in it. And as I'm looking at the different, stuff that you have for sale, like, it's all very affordable for anybody who wants to walk in there, but also who is going to look at things online. And I'm kind of curious if you could tell us a little bit about, how you curate your online selection, and then that balance between, brick and mortar and online sales for your business.
Yeah, I'm very intentional on being affordable. Like I'm prepping for a pop-up this weekend, the first one I've done in a while, because my friends who run a vintage shop are doing a vintage market at this brewery. And I've started to price stuff in it. I'm real like everything I'm pricing, I'm basically like 30, 35. Maybe I have like a handful of things that are more because they're, fancier or rare or something like that. But I mean, I'm very conscious about, when people contact me, they're like, I have all this design. I'm like, I don't know, I don't do designer. And even when people try to sell me stuff, I always, and sometimes I do buy stuff, but I curb those expectations pretty fast where I'm like, look, this is my price point. Like, if you've got stuff, like, I don't really want to be spending more than $5 or $10 on it, because even with that, I'm going to mark it up to maybe 30 or 40. Um, and my philosophy, and maybe this will change as I, you know, have to pay rent and things like that, is I'd rather move volume than uh have, a really expensive item sit there for a while. And when you look at a consumer model and what you want to, I guess, engage with and compete with, I want to keep my prices around what it would cost to go to Target or Old Navy or something like that. And so, yeah, my audience has veered a lot younger. I have a student discount. Um, and and that's, I do get compliments all the time on the fact that I'm affordable. And so that's, yeah, that, I mean, because I too, before I opened, I was selling very heavily on this website slash app called Whatnot that does live auctions. And it's gotten so just the quality of that marketplace has gone down so much. I don't really do it as much anymore. But um, I started to sort of learn that, like, when you're putting all these things in auction, like, okay, you talk about like loss leaders. This is, my God, like, this is the most businessy thing I can talk about. But Costco sells their rotisserie chickens at a loss because they know that if you're going to go in and buy a rotisserie chicken, you're going to buy other stuff. And I learned that in doing online auctions was, okay, like, here I'm gonna really advertise that I have like these one or two really cool vintage pieces, and maybe I'll start the bidding at 20 and maybe I paid 25 for it. But, so I might lose some money, or I mean, you're always losing money to some extent when in the bigger picture when you're doing it, because like you're like, oh, I paid gas, and I'm gonna pay for shipping supplies or things like that. But then it'd be like, okay, but that person who's going to buy this is going to buy all these other things. And maybe I spent $1 on those things and they'll buy those for 20. So, um, that's how I kind of, I mean, I still have to meet with an accountant. And, I mean, this might not be the best business model, kind of long term, but I guess, going back to the black market Wii, like, I never really thought of this. It's like, it's just that thing where you can do it to build the relationships and get people in the door. And then, you know, you'll still have the black market Wii, but you'll have other stuff. And so if I can provide affordable vintage and always provide affordable vintage, then maybe I do move into some higher end stuff, or I do have, you know, jackets for 100 or something like that. But yeah, if that was, uh, and yeah, so, and I guess I sell on Depop and stuff like that. I mostly just sell direct to consumer, like anyone that wants to buy, I sell sheets in bulk to, different, dressmakers and stuff like that. And yeah, and I still have to like finish my website and stuff like that. But for the most part, I just kind of sell directly through Instagram. And yeah.
Awesome. Which so I always before we kind of talk about where to find you online and things like that, I
Yeah.
always like to make space just for anything that we maybe haven't tackled. Is there anything on your mind that you kind of want to put out there before we wrap things up?
Um, oh my gosh. We went all over the place, and this was a really helpful interview, honestly, because it really made me think about things in a larger structure. And kind of where I've come from and where I'm going. And, um, and I knew going into this too that a lot of it was me kind of trying to hang on to the stuff of librarianship that I liked and that I thought was beneficial, and not just sending emails or something all day. It's I like interacting with people. I like being hands-on. I like planning events and things like that. And I've been able to, keep all that. And yeah, so like you're a very good interviewer because you're able to piece that all together. And I want to give you that compliment.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I will
Yeah,
I will wear that on my shoulder, and I will
as you should.
applaud you back that I've learned a lot in this conversation too, so I appreciate it. But for, let's make sure we get some customers to
Oh
you.
yes,
So,
customers, money.
Jaina, if people want to find you online, or if they want to find you in person, where should they follow you and where should they look?
Okay, so my Instagram is the best case for this. Still building a website. I have the domain, blah blah blah, but it's Dino-Mite, like dinosaurs. So it's Dinomite Vintage, and that's on Instagram, on TikTok, eventually dynamitevintage.com, and then I am located beautiful Long Island, tropical island getaway if you ever are looking for that. 2099 Wantagh Avenue in Wantagh, New York. I'm about a 10-minute walk from the Long Island Railroad station. So it's about a half hour ride to and from New York City. If anyone is cool enough to be pushing nuns down the stairs there. But yeah, so come in, and I'm really close to the beach too, which is really nice in the summer.
That's awesome. And I love this idea that like maybe dynamite tourism is the next thing where you come to your shop and you figure out what you need to wear for whatever event or excitement you want to hit up in the city. And you'll be extra cool and be wearing the highest quality clothing that you can
Highest
find
quality.
in Wantagh.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, Janet, thanks so much for joining me for this conversation. It was a delight.
Thank you so much.
I really hope you enjoyed that conversation. I love learning what makes people tick and figuring out what will motivate somebody to sort of uproot their life and try something new. Jaina has a fascinating story, and I really appreciate her sharing it with me. And I was lucky enough to go visit Dino-Mite Vintage just recently. So it's awesome. If you are interested in hand-picked quality clothing, or maybe you want to figure out a way to repurpose some 1960s bed sheets or something like that, go check out Dino-Mite Vintage in Wantagh. It is well worth your time. Moving ahead, we have more awesome interviews coming. I am over the moon, and I can't even begin to describe how excited I am for our next guest. On December 4th, we have author Gregory Maguire coming on the show. And if that name starts to sort of like burn your ears a little bit and you're not sure why, it's because Gregory Maguire is the writer of Wicked, the New York Times best-selling book about the Wicked Witch of the West that helps kind of humanize her, that was turned into one of the longest Broadway musicals of all time, Wicked, which is currently still running. And if you go anywhere, you'll notice that the Wicked movie is in theaters. So we are going to talk all things Wizard of Oz. We're going to talk all things writing history, and we're going to talk about what it's like to have created an entity or an enterprise, as he likes to say, that has its grips in people and really helps us empathize with those around us that maybe aren't doing the right thing. So if you are interested in that, please tune in to the Meditations with Ryan Zlomek podcast on December 4th. You can like or subscribe or do any of those things to make sure it comes your way. If you're looking for more fun things to listen to or you need more narratives in your brain, on episode 31, I was lucky enough to talk with Netflix executive Henri Houston about creative marketing. In episode 29, I talked with Nicole Austin, who's the head distiller at the George Dickel Distillery. Episode 24, I talked with cartoonist and playwright Dean Haspiel about doing sort of small black box theater. And if you're like me, you always need something food related. So episode 20, we have Amanda Hughes, who's the owner of the ice cream stand and currently is hard at work creating her new cafe, Cream and Coffee, which was announced on the show. If you like what you're hearing, please like, subscribe, share it, all the usual things we're used to. But writing reviews mean a lot as well. And if it's something where you have found benefit or value to this, please help get the word out by writing a review or just sending it to somebody that you think might find it interesting. Word of mouth is the best kind of communication. If you're interested in my work, you can find me all over the internet at Ryan Zlomek on Instagram and TikTok, The World of Ryan Zlomek on Facebook, or you can send me an email, meditations@ryanzlomek.com. But as always, please go out in the world, converse with somebody you don't know, make space for conversation because you just might learn something. Have an awesome, magical, and maybe even vintage day.